In a crumbling apartment building deep in the city, a young black woman who grew up in foster care lives quietly and alone. Every morning she gives warm water to an elderly man, one who's often shouted at and turned away by others. One day, when he didn't knock, she grew worried and discovered he'd had a stroke. She rushes him to the hospital. Through simple kindness and quiet compassion, the two become each other's safe haven, finally a real family at last. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thought. The morning light crept in through the half-closed blinds of apartment 3B, casting long, narrow lines across a modest kitchen. The kettle on the stove had just begun its gentle hum, steam whispering from the spout like a quiet companion. Emily sat at the small table by the window, stirring sugar into her tea with practiced stillness. Her apartment was neat, lived in, quiet, too quiet. She reached for the envelope she had left unopened since yesterday, a birthday card, no return address, just her name scribbled in a rushed hand. She opened it slowly, half hoping for a message that might surprise her, but inside was a generic greeting, typed, cold, unsigned. She held it for a moment, then sighed and tore it neatly in half, dropping the pieces into the trash. Another year, another day. No one remembered. She had long since stopped expecting anything else. Emily Carter was 26, a quiet woman with steady eyes and the kind of composure that came from learning to carry her own weight early. She had grown up in the foster system, shuffled between houses and caseworkers, and learned quickly that expectations led to disappointment. Now, she worked in accounting, punching numbers during the day and walking home through the echo of her own footsteps. Her world was small, but it was stable. She didn't ask for much, only peace, perhaps, and the occasional silence that didn't feel like absence. That was the way it worked, just right for as long as it fed. The building she lived in had history, not the charming postcard kind, but the kind that clung to the walls in chipped paint and drafty windows. The elevator rattled like an old lung, and the hallway lights flickered when it rained. Most people kept to themselves. Doors opened only when absolutely necessary, and greetings were mumbled more out of obligation than warmth. She liked it that way. There was no pressure to smile when she didn't feel like it. Still, there were routines that broke the gray. Every morning, like clockwork, at around 6:45, a soft knock would echo through the hallway, 3 gentle taps, spaced evenly, almost polite. She'd heard it for months now. It started at the far end of the hall and slowly moved toward her door. She used to wonder what it was until she finally opened the door one day and saw him, an elderly man, white, mid-80s maybe, with a thin build and deep-set eyes. He wore a coat too large for his frame and held a small thermos cup with both hands. "Good morning, miss," he said with a nod that carried more grace than most men half his age. "Would you mind if I asked for a little warm water, just enough for my medicine?" There was something in his tone, gentle, unassuming, that softened her defenses. She nodded and let him wait by the door while she poured from the kettle. That had become their rhythm. Every morning he would knock, every morning she would pour. They never said much, just the basics, how did you sleep, or stay warm today, but there was comfort in the consistency. Others weren't so kind. She'd heard the responses through her door when he knocked elsewhere. Some ignored him completely, others grumbled under their breath. Jake, the 30-something man across the hall, once muttered loud enough for her to hear, "What is this, a soup kitchen? Go buy your own kettle, old man." The sound of his door slamming shut had echoed with finality. But the old man never seemed bothered. He would simply nod, thank whoever listened, and move on to the next. He never raised his voice, never looked angry, just quietly persistent. Emily admired that. In a world that made it so easy to become bitter, he remained soft-spoken. She didn't even know his name yet. He didn't offer it, and she hadn't asked, but there was something about him that felt familiar, not personally, but spiritually. A kind of quiet dignity she'd seen in a few of the foster fathers who had tried, even when they hadn't known how. Something in the way he looked her in the eye and said thank you, like he meant it. Something in how he didn't assume she owed him kindness. And maybe, deep down, that's why she kept answering the door. Because for a moment each morning someone needed her. Not for reports or numbers or deadlines, but simply for the warmth she could offer. A cup of water. A moment of eye contact. A silent recognition that they both existed in this world, side by side, even if the world around them didn't much care. She didn't know yet how deeply that door would open. That this old man, fragile in body but firm in soul, would come to mean more to her than anyone had in years. That a life shaped by absence could find something whole again, starting with a knock and a kettle. But that morning, like every morning, she turned off the stove, filled the cup, and walked to the door with the same simple, steady grace. 3 knocks, right on time. That morning, the hallway smelled faintly of burnt toast and damp carpet as Emily stepped out to take her trash down. She was still half asleep, her slippers scuffing against the linoleum floor, when she heard voices, sharp, clipped, coming from the stairwell. She paused at the corner near the mailboxes, instinctively holding her breath. "Don't knock on my door again, do you hear me?" a woman's voice snapped, high-pitched and loud enough to echo. "I don't care who you are. People like you don't get to bother me at 7 in the morning. Go beg somewhere else." Emily's heart dropped. She leaned forward just enough to peek around the corner. There he was, Harold, standing stiff, slightly hunched, his thermos cup cradled in his hands as if trying to protect what little dignity he had left. Across from him stood a woman she hadn't seen before, white, probably in her late 40s, hair tied too tight, expression full of disdain. She wore a tailored bathrobe like it was armor, and stood firmly planted in her doorway, one hand gripping the frame, the other pointing a finger in his face like he was a pet. "You people are always looking for something for free," the woman hissed, "and don't try to act polite. It's manipulative. I know your type." Harold didn't speak. He just nodded, once, small, almost imperceptible, and turned away, his footsteps dragging a little more than usual as he moved down the hall. Emily felt her breath hitch. Something hot rose in her chest. Not just anger, but shame. Not because of Harold, but because she'd stood there a second too long, listening, watching, doing nothing. She dropped the trash bag where she stood and stepped out into the hall. "Mr. Whitmore," she called gently. He looked up, blinking like he wasn't sure where her voice had come from. "Would you like to come in for a minute?" she asked. There was hesitation in his eyes, just for a breath. Then he gave a slow nod. "That would be very kind, Emily." Back inside, she poured water into the familiar chipped mug with the tiny blue flower and placed it gently in his hands. He sat in his usual spot by the window, quieter than usual. His gaze was distant, fixed somewhere beyond the buildings outside, beyond the rooftops. "I didn't mean to overhear," she said, softly. He looked at her, not startled, just tired. "She's new," he said, almost apologetically. "Some folks don't understand." "No," Emily replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Some folks just choose not to." She hesitated, then sat across from him. "You shouldn't have to knock on anyone's door and be treated like that. Not ever." He smiled, faintly. "It's not about the water. Hasn't been for a while. Sometimes I think I just want to feel like I still exist, that someone remembers I'm here." "You don't have to prove you exist," Emily said, her voice tightening. "Not to anyone, least of all people who think kindness is a transaction." For a while neither of them spoke. The city buzzed softly beyond the glass. Harold sipped his water, slower than usual. That evening, Emily removed the sticky note with her name from her mailbox and wrote something new. "Mr. Harold Whitmore, welcome any time." She pressed it beneath her name, right where it belonged. The next morning, Emily woke earlier than usual. The apartment felt unusually quiet, the air too still, like something unspoken had shifted. She boiled water, as always, setting out the chipped blue mug with its single faded flower, and waited. 6:45 came, no knock. 6:50. Still silence. At 7:00, she opened the door and looked down the hallway, but there was no one there. No shuffle of slow footsteps. No soft voice greeting her with that old-fashioned politeness Harold always carried like a second coat. Her stomach tightened. Maybe he'd slept in. Maybe he wasn't feeling well. She waited another half hour, pretending to check emails, then finally gave in to the knot curling in her chest. She walked down the hallway to his apartment, Unit 4C, just above hers. She'd only been there once, to help him carry groceries a few weeks back. The door looked the same as always, except today it felt quiet. Too quiet. She knocked, gently. "Mr. Whitmore?" she called. Nothing. She knocked again, a little louder this time. "Harold, it's Emily. Are you all right?" Still no answer. Her hand hovered over the knob instinctively, then curled into a fist. She turned and hurried downstairs to the front office, breath quickening with every step. Mr. Price, the building manager, looked up from behind his smudged glass window when she approached. "Hey, Emily, everything all right?" "I think something's wrong with Mr. Whitmore," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "He hasn't come by this morning. He's not answering." Price frowned. "Harold? Huh. That man's got more routine than the sun, all right. I'll grab the spare key." Minutes later, they stood outside his door. Price knocked once, out of courtesy more than hope, then slid the key into the lock. The door creaked open. Emily stepped inside first. The apartment was dim, curtains half drawn, air stale. The heater was humming softly, but the silence beyond that was crushing. "Harold," she called, her voice trembling now. Then she saw him, crumpled on the floor near the kitchen table, one hand still clutching the edge of a chair as if he'd tried to pull himself up. His eyes were closed, breathing shallow. The thermos cup lay on its side nearby, a dark ring of dried tea staining the hardwood. "Oh God," she whispered, rushing to his side. "Call 911, she barked over her shoulder to Mr. Price, who was already fumbling for his phone. Emily knelt beside Harold, gently placing a hand on his forehead. "I'm here," she said, over and over, like a chant, like a promise. The paramedics came fast, but for Emily the wait felt infinite. They worked around her, checking vitals, fitting an oxygen mask, lifting his thin frame onto the gurney with the kind of practiced care that only comes from handling far too many bodies that have been alone too long. One of them asked if she was family. She opened her mouth to answer, hesitated, then said softly, "I'm the closest thing he has." The ambulance lights flashed against the walls as they wheeled him out. Emily followed in her car, gripping the steering wheel like it might splinter in her hands. The city blurred past her, all its noise and bustle muffled behind the ringing in her ears. At the hospital, the intake nurse repeated the question. "Relation to the patient?" "Friend?" she said this time. "Neighbor?" Then, almost inaudibly, "Someone who cares." They let her sit with him once he was stable, tubes in his arms, monitors beeping in slow, rhythmic defiance of the silence. She held his hand in both of hers, resting her forehead against his fingers. "Please don't go," she whispered. "Not like this." The hours crawled. Nurses came and went. A kind woman named Clarissa brought her tea in a blanket. At one point, Emily fell asleep in the chair beside his bed, head resting against the mattress, still holding his hand. When she awoke, it was to the faint sound of her name. "Emily," his voice was cracked, barely audible. She sat up, heart leaping. "Harold?" He looked at her, eyes glassy but aware. A faint smile formed on his lips. "You stayed?" "Of course I did," she said, her voice breaking. Harold Whitmore was born in 1940 in Birmingham, Alabama, the son of a factory worker and a seamstress. He'd been the first in his family to attend college, later earning a Ph.D. in philosophy from Northwestern. He'd taught at Middleton College for over 30 years, specializing in ethics and existential theory. He'd never married. His one great love, a fellow professor named Eli, had died young in the 1980 essay. Harold never spoke of it much, and no one ever asked. He had no children, no close family left. In retirement, he had drifted into the kind of quiet that people mistake for fading. But Harold had never faded. He had simply grown softer with the years, more deliberate in his presence, and now, with Emily by his side, something stirred again in his tired bones, something he thought had long since gone still. Clarissa came in later to check vitals, and paused when she saw Emily tucking the blanket around him. "Are you his daughter?" she asked gently. Emily looked at Harold. He gave her a small nod. She smiled, and for the first time in a long, long while said with quiet certainty, "Yes, I am." The days that followed moved slowly, like honey poured in winter, thick, quiet, unhurried. Harold remained in the hospital under observation, his strength returning inch by inch, breath by breath. Emily visited every day, bringing his favorite newspapers, a pair of thick wool socks she'd knitted during the long hours at his bedside, and little jars of ginger tea she made from scratch because the hospital brew tasted like boiled cardboard. She learned to navigate the hallways like a nurse, knew the names of the evening staff, and even memorized the sound his monitor made when he drifted into deeper sleep. It wasn't just duty, it was something deeper, unspoken, anchoring. One morning, after his vitals had stabilized and the color had returned to his face, she found Harold sitting up in bed, alert, a small box resting in his lap. His fingers traced its wooden surface like it held something sacred. Emily sat down in the chair beside him, brushing crumbs off her skirt from the muffin she'd scarfed on the bus. "What's that?" she asked, leaning forward. Harold looked at her with a softness that caught her off guard. "A keepsake," he said. "Something I've held on to for more than 40 years. He opened the lid slowly. Inside was a delicate hair clip, carved from dark wood, polished smooth with age, shaped like a crescent moon. It was simple but beautiful, understated like everything else about him. "I bought this for a student once," he continued, his voice distant. "Her name was Miriam, bright, stubborn, fierce as they come. I taught her ethics. She challenged me every class, argued until the bell, made me rethink my own syllabus." He chuckled. "She was supposed to give the valedictorian speech, but she dropped out 2 weeks before graduation. Family issues. Never came back. I never got to give this to her. Couldn't bring myself to throw it away either." He reached across the blanket and held it out to Emily. "I don't believe in coincidences, not anymore. I think some things find their way where they're meant to be." Emily hesitated. She hadn't worn a hair clip since she was 16, and certainly never anything so meaningful. But the way he looked at her, steady and certain, made her throat tighten. She reached for it, slowly, as if it might break beneath her touch. Harold's hand stopped hers halfway. "No," he said gently. "Let me." With slow, careful fingers, still trembling from age and healing, he reached up and brushed her curls back behind her ear. She turned slightly to help him. He gathered her hair at the nape of her neck, fingers tentative but sure, and twisted it into a loose knot. Then, delicately, he slid the clip into place. The motion was so intimate, so fatherly, that Emily couldn't breathe for a moment. Her eyes stung, but she didn't blink. No one had ever done that for her, not at school dances, not at birthdays, not before a job interview. No one had ever touched her hair with care instead of judgment. The weight of that simple act collapsed something quiet and hidden inside her, something that had curled inward for years. Harold leaned back, examining his work like a craftsman. "There," he murmured. "That's how a daughter should wear her crown." She laughed, soft, watery, surprised by how much those words mattered. "Do I look all right?" she asked. He smiled. "You look love." Later that afternoon, as she helped him into the wheelchair for his physical therapy walk, the nurse returned to change the IV and paused when she saw the clip. "Oh, that's beautiful," she said. "Family heirloom?" Harold gave a quiet nod. "You could say that." Emily rolled him gently through the hallway, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He told her stories about his mother, a seamstress who used to hum Billie Holiday under her breath while sewing into the night. About his father, who worked the iron press at a foundry for 30 years and never once missed a day, not even the morning Harold left for college. "They didn't have much," he said, "but they gave me everything that mattered. I suppose I've spent most of my life trying to pass that forward. Through teaching, through listening, through showing up." "You're still doing that," Emily said. "More than you know." A week later he was discharged. He refused to go to a nursing facility. Emily refused to let him go anywhere alone, so she packed up a small bag and moved into his apartment, just until he was steady again, she told herself. But she unpacked fully. She brought her books, her plant from the windowsill, the worn blanket from her couch. She cooked oatmeal in the mornings, labeled his pill organizer, filled his bookshelf with titles she thought he'd like. The little apartment changed, slowly, new warmth in the curtains, new laughter between the walls, new breath in every room. Emily placed the blue mug, the one he always used, on the kitchen counter next to the kettle where it would always be waiting. And each morning, without fail, Harold woke to the scent of ginger tea, the sound of humming in the hallway, and a daughter, chosen, not born, moving about the space like she'd always belonged. It started with a single post, just a late-night entry on Emily's quiet blog, the kind she kept mostly for herself, tucked away in the lonely corners of the internet where it felt safe to speak. She titled it, "The Father Next Door." The words poured out in one long, unbroken flow, about the quiet knocks in the morning, about the chipped blue mug, about Harold Whitmore, the 83-year-old former philosophy professor who once shaped young minds in lecture halls and now lived in a building where most people didn't even bother to look up when he passed. She wrote about the day he didn't knock, about how she found him collapsed and alone, about the hospital, the trembling hands, the hair clip. She wrote about what it felt like to be cared for the very first time, and how, without realizing it, she had stopped being just a neighbor and become a daughter. She didn't expect anyone to read it, but the post was shared, slowly at first, one reader at a time, until a few days later her inbox filled with messages. People told her about the elders in their lives, about their parents with dementia, about strangers they'd ignored at bus stops and now couldn't stop thinking about. Teachers commented, saying they remembered Professor Whitmore, some from decades ago, recalling how his lectures made them fall in love with questions more than answers. One wrote, "He taught me that truth wasn't a fact, it was a process. I've never forgotten that." The blog reached unexpected places. One afternoon, while Emily was helping Harold fold laundry, his hands still a little unsteady but growing stronger each day, she received an email from her company's CEO, Marcus Lewis. The subject line simply read, "Harold Whitmore." She clicked it with a small knot in her chest. It wasn't short. Marcus wrote that he had read her post 3 times before, believing it was the same Harold Whitmore who had taught him at Middleton College over 20 years earlier. "I was barely holding it together back then," he wrote. "No one believed I belonged there, except for him. He gave me a book, The Fire Next Time, and said, 'You don't need permission to belong. You're already here. Make them see it.'" That changed everything. Marcus had gone on to build one of the most respected firms in the city, but he never forgot the man who first told him he mattered. And now, that man lived just 1 floor above Emily, sipping tea in a robe patched with age. The next morning, a black SUV pulled up outside the building. Marcus himself stepped out, not flanked by assistants or wearing the power armor of his boardroom reputation, but in a plain coat and soft expression. When Emily opened the door, he didn't speak at first. He just looked at Harold and smiled like he was 13 again and seeing his hero. "Professor Whitmore," he said, voice catching slightly, "I owe you everything." Harold squinted for a moment, then his eyes lit up. "Marcus," he said, "from the 1999 graduating class. You wrote your final paper on Baldwin and identity theory." Marcus laughed, disarmed. "And you gave me a B+ because I didn't cite my sources properly?" "I was being generous," Harold replied, and they both laughed until the years between them disappeared. Emily watched them talk for hours, about old lectures, about the campus coffee that tasted like ink, about how much had changed. Then, quietly, Marcus turned to her. "You saved him," he said. "Not just his life, his legacy." She shook her head. "He saved me first." Marcus didn't argue. Instead, he offered her something she never expected. A full promotion, along with a permanent role leading the firm's new community outreach initiative, designed to honor educators who'd been forgotten. The project would begin with a scholarship in Harold's name. Harold Whitmore smiled, his eyes shining with something both fragile and fierce, like memory refusing to die quietly. Months later, they held a small ceremony in the park near the building, beneath the old oak trees where Harold liked to sit on warmer days. The air smelled of spring and something sweeter, perhaps healing, perhaps time itself folding gently. Emily stood at the podium, dressed simply, her hair pulled back with the same dark wood clip he'd given her. She spoke plainly. "I grew up without a family. I never called anyone Dad. I thought that word wasn't for people like me. But one morning a man knocked on my door and asked for nothing but a cup of water, and through that simple act, through quiet mornings and long afternoons, through stories and small kindnesses, I was given a father. Not by blood, but by choice. And I will spend the rest of my life proving that love doesn't need permission. It just needs a place to land." The crowd rose in applause, slow, genuine, full of faces touched by his legacy and hers. Afterward, Harold and Emily sat on a bench beneath the trees, watching petals fall. A few children played in the distance, their laughter bright. Harold reached over, took her hand, and said softly, "You gave me a second life." Emily smiled, rested her head on his shoulder, and whispered, "You gave me my first." And from that day forward, no one in the building ever heard knocking at Emily's door again. Because some doors, once opened, never need knocking twice. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.